All right, minasan, yokoso. Today we will do a case study about an electronic device having a waterproof structure. Um, 今度のビデオが、だけ英語、だから、ゆっくりします。Sorry, I'm still learning. This was this seminar is based on a article, an article I wrote recently, and I presented the article, but a friend was unable to attend, so everyone gets to benefit from me re-recording this. So we'll go through some background. We'll get into the applicant's response. We'll talk about some issues, and then I'll offer a proposal. This is a case study. If you're here only for translation purposes, this video is not for you. Well, you're welcome to attend, of course, but you're probably not going to be interested. So the background for this case is that generally the application relates to an electronic device, such as a smartphone, that includes a waterproof structure. And in such a device, conventionally, gaps between a front plate, a rear plate, or a mid plate and a rear plate may be coupled by an adhesive member, such as a tape. This adhesive member may perform a waterproof function, as well as coupling between the front plate, the mid plate, and the rear plate. And when the electronic device is disassembled for repair, the adhesive member may be damaged in a disassembling process. Okay, this is the problem in the art. So our invention is shown on the right side of the slide. We're going to maintain some consistency between the gold, red, green, and blue throughout the seminar. There is an additional orange and a purple that are used as contrast colors. So those will change. They're just for contrast purposes. But this gold, red, green, and blue should be pretty consistent. So our figure 5 illustrates an electronic device 500, including a side member, a mid plate, and a waterproof member. The watertight, that is waterproof, member may be disposed at a contact portion to seal a space between the side member and the mid plate. And this mid plate may be referred to as a first portion, and the side member may be referred to as a second portion. So there's some inconsistent terminology throughout. Advantageously, the waterproof member may have a stronger adhesive force to adhere to the second portion than to the first portion. Okay, so this little dark lump 530 adheres more strongly to the bottom than to the top, and thereby in a process of separating the mid plate, the waterproof member may be prevented from or avoid being damaged and remain while maintaining a shape in the second portion. This application includes several embodiments for achieving the stronger adhesive force between the waterproof member and the second portion. So let's get into how applicant responded to in this prosecution. So the first thing that happens is there's a restriction requirement. Again, we're borrowing from a friend's images on the left that we've marked up with the pink and the orange to show that there is a restriction requirement, including identifying 2 inventions. The first invention is directed to a device including a coating layer. This is shown only in applicants' figures 6B and 6C. And invention 2 is directed to an electronic device with a greater bonding force of a waterproof member with the second portion. The restriction incorrectly identifies this as corresponding to figures 7 to 11. Correctly, this is figures 6 to 11. The important part being that the subject matter of figures 6b and 6c is still within the scope of Invention 2. So the applicant restricts prosecution to Invention 1. Therefore, they can prosecute claims 1 through 6 that are directed to an electronic device, including a coding layer. In doing so, the applicant withdraws Invention 2, and therefore they cannot prosecute claims 7 through 20, which are directed to an unequal bonding force of the waterproof member. And this is that orange color I was telling you about, where what it underlines will change throughout. The issue with this restriction requirement is that the claim numbers are not what we're electing. Okay, the claim numbers are kind of arbitrary. If we add a new claim, which will be numbered 21, it's not going to be withdrawn simply because we didn't elect that number. Instead, whether or not that claim is withdrawn relates to the subject matter that the new claim includes. And therefore, these claim numbers are somewhat incidental, and that'll become important momentarily. So now that we know which invention we're choosing, I can show you our particular embodiment, as well as the claim that we're prosecuting, the independent claim that we're prosecuting. So the claim is shown on the left side of the slide. The corresponding figure, 6b, I believe, is shown on the right side of the slide. In addition to electing Invention 1, the applicant cancels withdrawn claims 7 through 20 and adds new claims 21 through 27 in the restriction response. Right, you can amend claims, add claims, delete claims. You can do all sorts of things in a restriction requirement and in an election. When they add these new claims, they don't identify support. And I have identified it for you on the right side of the slide. This is important because all of this new subject matter relates to the withdrawn invention. And the reason we know that is because it's very close to the withdrawn claims. Therefore, new claims 21 through 27 should be entered, but they should be withdrawn either on applicant's own initiative, which would be the proper thing to do, or by the examiner's action. These claims will be eligible for rejoinder at allowance, right? You can still get coverage for these features in your issued patent, but you can't prosecute the application based on these features. After the restriction requirement, the first office action issues. It includes 4 different rejections of Claim 1. All 4 are 103 rejections based on Kim 061 in view of a secondary reference. There are other rejections in this office action, of course, but the relevant rejections are on this slide. You can see that, Claim 21 notably is only rejected on this first rejection. So the primary reference, Kim 061, is directed to waterproofing a battery cover of a portable terminal. And in each of these 4 rejections, the examiner relies on that reference for the same features. And by that, I mean the examiner relies on each of the secondary references to remedy the common deficiency that Kim 061 does not disclose a coating layer disposed between the first portion and the waterproof member. Okay, we're not changing our reliance on the primary reference in view of each of these four secondary references. They're all the same. And if you look in the top right corner of the slide, you can see that each of these references is directed to a very different technology. For example, Kim 412 is directed to a display device for a smartphone. Lin is directed to a circuit cable. Yamaguchi 057 is directed to a hinge module for a cellular phone. And Kubo is directed to an adhesive tape for binding wires. Okay. So the question that I think should be asked is whether, from the examiner's point of view, these secondary references are interchangeable. And by that, I mean, is there a common issue in the claim such that not just these four references, but maybe any number of references can be used to reject Kim 061, right? There's no similarity between these technologies. They all can be included in a smartphone, right? Lin and Kubo, they can all be included, and that's what the examiner is proposing. But they're not from, common technologies such that, they're very close. They're from very different technologies that can be incorporated into a smartphone. And so, there's maybe these are interchangeable. So how does the examiner actually rely on Kim 061? Well, he's got his marked up version in black and white on the right side of the slide. I added the coloring, of course. And again, the violet is just a contrast color. It's not the same throughout. But again, the gold, red, green, and blue are the same throughout. When I interview my patent applications, I like to begin by looking at the figures and showing differences and similarities. And then I look at the claim to say, okay, well, how do I claim that difference? So we're going to start by looking at, applicants' figures 5 and 6A on the left side of the slide. These are borrowed from the applicant's response to the first office action. And on the right side of the slide, you can see how the examiner relied on Kim 061. And the feature we're about to pay attention to is this mid plate in yellow. So the applicant approached the rejection from the view that the Kim 061 battery cover is a different device than is intended by Claim 1. Okay, that is, they're not clarifying the invention itself, right? They're not clarifying the coding layer. They're clarifying the context in which this advantageous coding layer exists. But the surprising thing is that they don't illustrate figures 6B through 6C in their response. And again, these are the only figures showing the inventive coding layer. This is actually consistent throughout the prosecution. They never show these two figures, which again are the only two figures in the patent application that show the invention to which they restricted prosecution. The amendments are persuasive. Let me go back. The important part that they argue is that the mid plate extends outside of the inner space and is disposed between the front plate and the side member. There are other amendments, but that's the most important. This amendment is found to be persuasive. And so the examiner rejects Claim 1 now under 35 USC Section 103 as obvious over the newly cited reference Yamaguchi 818. Periodically, I receive questions about single reference 103 rejections. We don't really do much different for them, but this is one such rejection. So if you want to see how we're, how people handle it, here you go. Pardon me a second. I need to cough. So on the right side of the slide, you can see Yamaguchi 818, figure 8. And this is directed to a housing 130, including adhesive tape bonded to a first joint surface of a front case and to a second joint surface. There's also a binder layer that is applied to the adhesive tape. The binder layer in, kind of this pink or purple being the coating layer. Again, we're going to look at the two figures side by side. This is borrowed from applicant's eventual response to office action number 2. You can see we have a portion of the midplate 515 that may be provided below a portion of the side member 514. So you can see that there's this kind of, inside this orange circle, there's this little portion of the side member that extends up. And therefore there's this other portion of the midplate in the purple rectangle that is provided below that portion. There's also a screw illustrated in a red dotted line that couples the midplate to the rear plate. And then, this outer edge of the midplate in orange extends outside of the inner space and is provided between the front plate and the side member. And you can see on the right side how that's not the case between the Yamaguchi orange and blue portions. Well, how does the applicant actually claim this? They say that there's a portion of the midplate that is disposed below a portion of the side member. This is on the right side of the slide. And this portion is releasably secured to the rear plate. This releasably secured portion refers to the screw. They also clarify that the outer edge in orange extends above the side member in blue. There's also a minor amendment to the coating layer here that makes it broader. I'm not really going to pay much attention to that at this point, though. This amendment is successful, and the examiner now rejects claim 1 as obvious over Choraku in view of Yamaguchi 057. And in doing that, the examiner is relying on the Yamaguchi 057 reference for the same coding layer feature as it was relied on in the first office action. So the applicant has merely traded primary reference Kim 061 for the primary reference Choraku. Right? We've already seen Yamaguchi 057 being applied for this feature. And as we'll see in a second, the examiner's reliance on Choraku is basically the same as in office action number 1 for Kim 061. So here's Choraku. This is a bit of a busy slide. I apologize, but I wanted to show everything together. So in Choraku, there's a cellular phone that includes a first enclosure section, a frame-like gasket, and a second enclosure section, 110, 30, and 120. We've got the color-coded portion of the claim in the lower left side, and we've got the color-coded figure to which this corresponds, as apparently relied on by the examiner in the upper right side. All right, well, what is Yamaguchi actually teaching? Well, there's a mobile phone that includes a first hinge part and a gasket, as well as a second hinge part, including a sliding surface. Okay. Again, this is the same as it was discussed in office action number 1. It's just that, in office action 1, we didn't really dive into the teachings of the reference. Now it's become a bit more important. This sliding surface, 122 in Yamaguchi, is subjected to a surface treatment such as Teflon coating to securely satisfy a waterproofing property. And you can see in the upper right portion, the important part of this reference is that there's a coating layer disposed on the first portion of the midplate. That's the claim language that we're concerned about here. And this coating layer is the pink portion on the left side, but that's not shown in the figures. What is shown in the figures is the sliding surface 122 and second hinge part 120 in blue. So it's a little bit confusing. But basically, we're paying attention to the blue because that is the portion on which the pink coating layer exists, which is different than the first portion of the midplate in orange. So you can kind of see how this might go. So again, the applicant relies on their figure 5, distinguishing over Choraku figure 2. They're going to bring in this portion in purple that corresponds to a display that has not been claimed yet. And this isn't really shown in detail in Choraku figure 2. You can kind of see where it would be, between 130 and 140. But Choraku really doesn't make it so clear. How do they claim this difference? We've got the marked up version of the slide on the right. In this middle portion, you can see the display is supported by a surface of the midplate facing the front plate. And at the bottom of the claim, you can see an orange bracket. And the important part here is that the orange bracket is a feature incorporated into claim 1 from dependent claim 21. So it's kind of surprising that the examiner accepts this amendment. Instead, the examiner should issue a notice of non-compliant amendment. The reason is that this feature belongs to withdrawn invention number 2. Okay, if you compare this feature to original claim 7, you'll see. And the other issue here, and we're going to talk more about other issues during prosecution, but is that the examiner rejected claim 21 in office action number 1. So of course, I agree that this feature is important to the overall invention, right? If I were drafting the application, actually, this would probably be my claim 1, would have this, I'd switch claims 1 and 7. But if this feature is so important, then it's surprising that the applicant did not argue this feature in reply to office action number 1, right? There's only one rejection on claim 21. And the examiner did reject this claim, right? They shouldn't have. It should have been withdrawn. And that's probably why the examiner allowed the applicant to incorporate it here, is because it had already been examined. But it should never have gotten to this point. And if it had, which it did, then you kind of wonder why the applicant didn't argue this sooner. Not that I would have, to be clear. I mean, you're asking the applicant to do a lot of work in response to the first office action then, right? You're overcoming 4 rejections on the independent claim, plus additional arguments towards a dependent claim. It's quite a bit of effort. All right, but what are the issues in this prosecution? Well, the restriction response included this claim amendment that improperly presents its changes. For example, it deletes the phrase comprising an adhesive material without showing strike through. There's also this strange incorrect correction, like it already said portion or something, and they deleted some other word and added portion, but the other word didn't exist in the claim. I don't know. The applicant seems to be working from a different set of claims. But let's talk about the overall strategy here, right? Why would the applicant not rely on figure 6B and 6C and not amend the coding layer? I don't know. Withdrawn independent claim 7 covers multiple embodiments. So for prosecuting that claim instead, right, some different, we're prosecuting the divisional application. Here, or there, more accurately, amending only the context makes sense, right? We're trying to cover all these different embodiments. I don't really want to clarify the invention itself because that would probably choose only one embodiment. So I'm going to clarify the context instead. That would make sense, again, in a prosecution directed to independent claim 7. Here, we're only prosecuting independent claim 1, and that corresponds to only one disclosed embodiment. And so amending at the point of novelty makes a lot more sense here because that's all we're trying to cover. We don't really care about the context as much. We might not, as long as we're showing that our inventive feature is novel and non-obvious. There was quite not a bit, but there was some estoppel, unnecessary estoppel that was created during this prosecution. For example, in response to office action number 1, the applicant argues that as shown in Kim 061 figure 6, the waterproofing plate is provided completely inside of the rear case and battery cover. Figure 6 does not show a portion of the waterproofing plate being provided outside of the rear case and the battery cover. Okay, fine. Is that what the claim says? Not quite. The claim says that the midplate comprises an outer edge extending outside of the inner space and disposed between the front plate and the side member. So there's some difference here. All right, Brian, but who cares, right? What is the effect of this difference? Well, the effect is that we can make additional arguments that might not be within the scope of the claim, but are within the scope of the arguments, right? Within the scope of the estoppel, maybe is a better way of phrasing that. And to some extent, it depends on whether we're arguing non-infringement or invalidity. Yes, there's some overlap there that relates to the date, but there are also separate issues. For example, for infringement, your engineers and attorneys might work together to devise a product that doesn't meet claim 1. Okay, they can look at this, they can copy claim 1, they can look at this estoppel, they can copy the figure out what the scope of claim 1 is. Pardon me. And figure out, how to meet the expanded scope of the estoppel to basically design around claim 1. And so therefore there's a tangible effect, right? We know going into this what the scope of claim 1 that we are allowed to capture, as well as the scope of or we can, make arguments about the scope of the estoppel to design a product. For invalidity, the estoppel will allow attorneys to consider additional prior art. So the harm here is a little bit more speculative, right? I don't know that there's an additional prior art reference out there that doesn't meet claim 1, but does meet the scope of the estoppel and therefore can now be applied in an invalidity proceeding. But there might be such a reference. There might be a dozen such references. I don't know. But that's the effect of this estoppel. If you read my underlying article, I also talk about reissue several times. The rule that is of concern here is that reissue will not be granted to recapture claim subject matter which was surrendered in an application to obtain the original patent. And so surrender can occur one of two ways: by adding limitations to a claim, or by stating or arguing that a limitation defines over the art. And so when we respond to office actions, of course, we want to present good patentability arguments, sometimes a few of them, but we also want to limit the amount of claim language argued, right? Because now we're saying that that claim language is necessary to define over the art, and it reduces our ability to reissue the claim in case we want an expanded scope, for example, to capture an infringer. So, again, Brian, well, who cares? Well, in response to office action number 1, the arguments include a feature of a midplate comprising a metal material. I'm pretty sure that it doesn't have to include a metal material. How do I say that? Claim 7 doesn't have that feature. Okay, so unless there's something important about the metal, the interaction between the metal and the coating layer, which is not at all described in this application, then the feature of the metal material could have been deleted in a reissue application. Except now it cannot, because arguments were made to that feature. In addition, in response to office action number 3, the applicant made amendments surrendering 2 alternative embodiments relating to the coupling of the display to the front plate. Okay, again, the application clearly calls for 3 alternatives. They've limited it to just one. I don't know why. We'll talk about my counter proposals momentarily, but you can't take that out now. You have to file a continuation if you want to try and get this claim to cover the other 2 embodiments. There were some later issues in the prosecution as well. In response to office action number 3, claim 1 was amended to clarify the feature of a coating layer disposed on a surface of the first portion of the midplate. I don't understand the purpose of this amendment. I don't. If the coating layer is disposed on the first portion, the coating layer must be on a surface thereof. I don't know, other than maybe accuracy, why you would make this amendment. This is the sort of amendment that maybe an examiner would insist on during an interview, but at this stage, there have been no interviews conducted. So I don't know. I don't get it. And therefore, this limitation creates estoppel that's only beneficial to accused infringers, right? It doesn't improve the patentability of the invention, or of claim 1, it seems. But it does limit claim 1, and therefore creates some estoppel. There's no benefit to applicant. So the only person really being benefited is an accused infringer. In addition, there's an interview on January 31st, 2022. This is approximately 2 weeks after the response to the 3rd office action is filed. There's no other significance to this date. This isn't like the 6-month date of the application or near the 6-month date where we're calling the examiner on a regular basis to ask them to work on the application so that the case doesn't go abandoned. The only thing I can think of is that, maybe they contacted the examiner before they filed the response to conduct an interview, and the examiner said, I can't, I'm busy, but I can conduct an interview in 2 weeks. and you can file a supplemental response. Maybe that's what happened. I don't know. There's no record of it. But the strange thing is that an unknown attorney contacts the examiner. Let me be clear. This isn't an attorney at the firm, right? This isn't like me picking up the phone and calling. This is an attorney at the correct firm. The issue is that this attorney appears nowhere else on the paperwork. Okay, this is the guy in the next office over calling the examiner instead of the responsible attorney. The attorney doesn't appear on the filing, doesn't appear on the election, doesn't appear on any of the responses, doesn't appear on the IDSs. It's just somebody else at the firm calls up the examiner. Again, the only thing I can think of is that a supplemental amendment is discussed, seemingly by someone that doesn't know the case. But the examiner does indicate that the application will be allowed, and so it is. All right, Brian, that's great that you don't really like this, but what would you have done instead? All right, well, here's my proposal. So first, we're going to go back to office action number 1. Okay, this is the same slide as before. I'm not really going to go into it. It's mostly just here to refresh your memory about where we're coming from. How am I going to address all of this? I'm just going to make a small amendment based on our figure 5B. Or 6B or whatever it is. Again, the issue is our coding layer. That's the invention that we've restricted prosecution to. Previously, we have this really broad phrase, disposed between the first portion and the waterproof member. I'm just going to clarify it a bit. I'm going to say disposed on the first portion and abutting the waterproof member. Because I think that this is the issue that the examiner is trying to show me, right? He says there's 4 different secondary references, Lin and Kubo and, so on, that disclose this feature, but they all seem to lack a lot of features. They don't have this code. They have a coding layer, but it's not the one we intend in our claim. And so I'm going to limit the structure of my coding layer to overcome all 4 references pretty easily. All right, well, how do I do that? Here you go. We're going to do it quickly because there's 4 of them. So in Kim 412, figure 6A, this layer, I think it's ADP1, is not disclosed as waterproof. In Lin figure 3, I think it's this layer 14, is not disclosed as waterproof, right? We're not placing this coding layer in the right spot. It's got to be relative to this waterproof member. Kubo is in text. It concerns, sorry, the relevant parts in text. Kubo concerns a primer composition that improves adhesion between a base film and an adhesive layer of an adhesive tape. There are figures, but this isn't really shown. Kubo doesn't teach that the primer composition abuts the Kim 061 waterproofing module 240. One of the things that commonly happens is that, as patent attorneys, we argue in the negative. Oh, it doesn't disclose this. It doesn't disclose that. And that's important to reduce estoppel. But humans like to know what a reference teaches instead. And so for the purposes of this seminar, and also probably the purposes of an interview, again, in the audible record, but not in the written record, Kubo seems to teach the primer composition abuts the base film and the adhesive layer, right? That's where it is. It's between the 2. That's why it doesn't abut the waterproofing module. But I want to be clear, don't put that kind of comment in your remarks, right? I'm just saying it for our session. It's okay to say it during an interview, but we don't want to make admissions about what Kubo does teach. We want to focus on the failings of Kubo to teach features relevant to our claim. Yamaguchi 057 concerns treating a sliding surface with a Teflon coating. We discussed that before. The examiner seems to acknowledge that Yamaguchi 057 does not teach which portion is coated. For example, the examiner says, the examiner says that there are only two options possible. But that doesn't mean that coating the first portion was known, right? Like, yeah, that might have been the only thing possible, but maybe no one did it. In addition, the examiner asserts that coating the first portion was a design choice with predictable results. For that kind of rejection, we argue that coating the first portion solves a stated problem. This is based on the In re Cooley case and discussed in this MPEP section. And this should, these are basically my remarks. This is all I would argue to overcome this rejection. Okay, well, does that place the application and condition for allowance? I don't think so. I think that the reference cited by the examiner in the next office action is equally germane to our amended claim. So I've marked it up to reject my own claim. Let's compare R6B to Yamaguchi 818. What's my thought process here? Well, again, I want to focus on the inventive coding layer, which is in pink. But the problem is that the location of the Yamaguchi binder 521 on the right side in pink seems similar to the location of the recited coding layer 540 in our figure. Okay. Well, what's my next option? Well, it might be possible to distinguish the recited waterproof member over the Yamaguchi adhesive tape. Again, this is in the red circle, by clarifying that the waterproof member is continuous, okay? That's the case in our figure 6B. But if you look at our application, embodiments shown in figures 7 through 9 don't have a continuous waterproof member, okay? And so although our specification does not explicitly contemplate combining these embodiments, right, figure 7 through 9 with figure 6, the application also doesn't say that they're mutually exclusive, right? You could have both. And as a slightly technical person reviewing this, they seem to work together. They seem cooperative in achieving their inventive goals. So even though my application doesn't tell me that they can be combined, we know enough as technical people to say, like, hey, these are the sorts of things that could work together. That is within the scope of the inventive concept. And so an amendment clarifying the red circled portion seems overly limiting. All right, well, I got to do something. Now what? Well, our purple portion, 514, clearly has a different shape than the joint surface 411 of Yamaguchi 818, also in purple, right? That's easily seen. An applicant's midplate 515 in gold has a different shape than the front case 30 in Yamaguchi. And again, these are edited figures, just to kind of blow it up so we can see it. All right, well, how am I going to claim that? I'm going to say that there's a side member, including a wall shown in purple, protruding from the second portion, the wall being on an outer portion of the side member relative to the second portion. Cool. How does that overcome the art? Well, now we're showing the wall that's not shown in purple. It would be in purple if it were here. It's not present. That's why it's not shown on the figure. Protruding from the side portion, second portion in blue. And that should overcome this art, right? Brian, I got a question. What if this is the second portion? Okay. I mean, yeah, that could be the second portion. And that's the wall. Ooh, yeah, sorry. When I did this article, I didn't catch that interpretation. Sumimasen. I tried to be consistent with the applicant's language. The second portion is recited only by its function of facing the first portion. And so what I should have done, instead of claiming relative to the second portion, is claiming relative to a structure, claiming the wall relative to a structure, like the waterproof member or the coating. I do these videos, I'm honest with you, it's when I tell you I do it in response to the first office action and I can see how the prosecution goes, it's really because I haven't looked at it. And when I make a mistake like this and I catch myself, I'm like, oh, I could have rejected this. I will tell you, I made a mistake here. Potentially. I mean, maybe the examiner doesn't catch this, but maybe the examiner does. So what's the revised amendment look like? It's this. Instead of saying relative to the second portion, now I say that it's outer relative to the waterproof member. It's clear that there's no wall outside of the waterproof member. What about office action number 3? Well, the examiner relied on Choraku in view of Yamaguchi 057. The examiner relies on Yamaguchi 057 for the same features as in office action number 1, right? Because the applicant doesn't amend the coding layer. We did. But this time, the examiner drops the KSR and design choice rationales. And so it's reasonable to assume that our arguments would have been successful in response to the first office action because the examiner withdrew those without any argument on behalf of the applicant. All right, well, Yamaguchi does teach a coding on the second hinge part 120. We showed this earlier in the figures, but again, it's not on the first hinge part 110. We discussed this with regard to the applicant's arguments, but that's why our amended claim also might not be rejected here. Okay, Brian, is your proposed claim allowable? Right? The applicant has, I think it's an issued patent at this point. They have a patent, you're just speculating. I don't know. It's impossible for me to say if my claim is allowable. It's unethical for me to say if it's allowable, actually. I will tell you it's not facially unallowable. Okay. Oftentimes, claims have a breadth that prevents examiners from allowing applications. This comes up all of the time in the interviews. I mean, this happens more than 50% of the time in interviews that, you'll present something and the examiner will say, okay, maybe it overcomes the art, but I can't allow your application. Your claim is too broad. It's because they're looking for particular interpretations that will prevent them from allowing the case. I don't know, about my claim here, but it doesn't seem to have that breadth problem, right? This doesn't seem to be so broad that the examiner would be required to reject the claim to make his or her boss happy. I think that this claim could be allowable. Is my proposed claim broader? Well, that really depends on, how things get litigated. But certainly my claim has a lot fewer words. There's certainly a lot less words to be interpreted and argued against the applicant. But again, broader or even narrower is going to depend on what does the competitor do and what does the prior art show? And, you'd have to relitigate the case, or you'd have to litigate the case, basically. One of the things that did strike me, though, in terms of the overall prosecution is that the applicant didn't add additional independent claims, such as means plus function. It seems like it would have been really trivial. You've got plenty of extra claim space in your claims for such independent claims. you get 3 independent and 20 total. You've got plenty of space for additional dependent claims as well. If it were my case, I would have drafted dependent claims directed to the features of figure 6b, not figures 5 through 6a. Again, those don't show the novel coding layer, the inventive coding layer. So I would have focused on 6b and 6c, which do. And they don't all have to relate to the coding layer, right? They can relate to different aspects of the context for the coding layer. But that's how you advance prosecution quickly, is you give the examiner alternative features to consider in the case that your independent claim is not rejected, or is rejected, sorry, is not allowable. I get a lot of questions about means plus function. Is that really what we should do here, Brian? Usually you see means plus function in electronics cases, and in particular in computer implemented inventions. Yeah, means plus function is great for mechanical cases, especially as here when it's in addition to a structural claim. Right, you have the structural claim that recites the coding layer. Maybe we can have a means plus function claim that corresponds to this coding layer, or even some other aspect of the claim to provide an additional scope of protection. Means plus function claims are commonly infringed. They are narrower, but they're of a similar scope to allow Japanese claims. And of course, Japanese claims are infringed. So why wouldn't means plus function claims get infringed periodically? They also are, because they're narrower than a structural claim in many cases, they are more likely to withstand invalidity attacks. And that concludes it. Again, today we went through the background of the application. We talked about the applicant's response to the different office actions. We talked about some issues in those responses, and I had my counter proposal. If you have questions, you can email me. You can find us on the web. I don't use Twitter much anymore. That site's kind of exploding. You can find me on the Fediverse instead, and on YouTube, which is probably how you're seeing this. Thank you so much. Have a great day.